And so there's a lot of layers to this history that I think for a lot of the white Americans who feel like this is just an accusation and this is just yet another case of calling their people historically racist or calling them racist today. In my experience, the African American community is much more sophisticated about understanding that some of these dynamics, for example, with the GI Bill and whatnot, it's mundane complicity of white folks who are benefiting from a system and looking the other way. They're not necessarily getting up in the morning and saying, I want to be racist. And there's an understanding of that amongst those of us who are in the field doing this work. So they're just, again, coming back to the learning of the history. It's liberatory to get beyond even the very concept of race.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I know I'm over.
Thank you, Ms. Dean. Ms. Sylvia, you're on.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And first, I want to thank the chairman for bringing this forward, and of course to my colleague from Houston that we have worked for many years on so many social justice issues at home. It's just great to stand with you again, and this time here on such a very, very important national topic. I am a co-sponsor, and I've pledged to you that I will work shoulder to shoulder with you to make sure we get this done. And to all the people in the audience, thank you for being here. I know it's been a long hearing, but I think it's going to be. Well, thank you for being here, and I know you've been waiting, but I think the waiting will be worth it when we get to the end of the tunnel. So thank you all for being here. And Bishop, I want to just start with you because it really did warm my heart that you have some scripture notes here and that you mentioned Jesus. You know, I have a very deeply firm religious belief that we really are all created equal and that we really are all children of God. And I want you to just pretend that instead of speaking to us right now, that you're speaking to the average American who may not have read everything that we have, may not have been as attuned to this hearing, but is kind of wondering what this is really all about, because as much as you say and others have said that this isn't about a check, the bottom line is that when some people start talking about reparations, they think that it's just about that. So my question to you is, what would Jesus do about reparations?
Well, when it comes to those questions, I like to remind people, I'm in sales, not management. I don't, so I'm not going to make those decisions.
Very nice, it's a good start.
But I want to be clear, it's not just about a check.
Correct.
When I think about some African-American women who are languishing in nursing homes with no money, no wealth, no, let's cut a check. I think about some others where a check would be really, really good. So I just wanted to be clear about this. But it's not essentially about money. It's about being good. There's been talk here about our nation being a great nation, or to make it great again, or the greatest nation of all. I'm more concerned about this nation being good. Let's be good. Let's do a good thing. And if we can be good enough, then let history and let people around the world say, the United States is great. Not because you can make a lot of money there, not because you can enrich yourself, not because of the size of your military or your armaments. They're great because they're good. And so I'm here today to witness to being good about this, that there is some unfinished business in this nation. Lastly, about the souls. In 1903, W.E.B. Du Bois wrote that famous book, The Souls of Black Folk. I would like to see another book written, The Souls of White Folk. The souls of white folk in this nation right now. What does it do to your soul to know that some of the benefit you get from your white skin and your background is not accrued to everybody? What does that do to your soul? And so this is a soulful act, I think, that we are talking about today. And it's really going to take all of us. I said earlier that we've forgiven you. And that what I mean is we're here. We're in America. We want America to be good and great. Desmond Tutu, Archbishop Desmond Tutu of South Africa said, ones. Without forgiveness, there is no future. We have to forgive one another, but that doesn't mean we stop there. We have work to do, and this is work for reconciliation. I wonder if my sister here...
Well, actually, I had a question for
thank you.
Mr. Coates. But you'd have to go really quickly. I had one question for Mr. Coates, so if you wanted to add something real quick. I'm running out of time.
No, I'm the economist on the panel, so it's a little bit...
No, I know that.
It's a little frustrating that economic questions are being directed to non-economists. Well, I think I have some things that I'd like to be able to say about some of this. But thank you, my brother, for giving me, for passing the mic. I really do appreciate it. The questions about predatory lending really need to, your sister Congresswoman raised, really need to be dealt with, because it's not just that it's something that's happening
If you're going to talk about predatory lending, could you also add, because what I was going to ask him, you could probably answer also, this whole history of the exclusion of blacks from some of the early programs like Social Security and the GI Bill and others, because it all is about economic security. So if you could blend your answer, that would be great, because then I would use up my time and get both questions in.
Sure. I mean, we can go back and look at the minimum wage, which exclude farm workers in the South, which were predominantly black people, excluded domestic workers, who were black women. And so these folks were excluded not only from the minimum wage, but also from the Social Security system. And so your comment about black women in nursing homes is very pointed, given all of that. I mean, we have to look at this. The hearts and minds questions, I'm an economist, so I leave that to the Reverend. But what I want to, but my thing is, let's look at the economic underpinnings of the inequality that exists in this country, the wealth gap that exists in this country, and the differences that it makes. Sister Congresswoman, when you talked about predatory lending, a third of the people who had predatory loans qualified for regular loans, a third of them. However, they did not get them because of the way that slavery, racism basically segregated people. So while it's lovely to sing Kumbaya, which I don't do very often, I think it's even better to talk about what's going on economically and the differences that exist because of the wealth gap. When a black man is arrested, absent wealth, they lay up in the jail for I don't know how many days because they don't have the home to mortgage to get the bail. And cash bail is discriminatory. And so we can just go down the list and talk about the very many ways that racism affects the quality of folks' lives. And with all due respect to these Kumbaya brothers over here who, you know, I'm proud of my family too. I mean, we good black people too. I have a PhD, I had 2 MBAs in my family, blah, blah. I'm not going to give you my family history. But you know, it is irrelevant. It is irrelevant when you're dealing with structure. I want y'all, Congress people, to deal with issues of economic structure, and an economic structure has generated an inequality that makes it difficult for people to live their lives. When zip code determines what kind of school that you go to, when zip code determines what kind of food you can eat, these are the vestiges of enslavement that a lot of people don't want to deal with. Forgive my, you know, I'm kind of over the top, but I usually am. Those in the audience who know me know, you know, tick, tick, boom. But the fact is that I'm gratified, Sheila, Congresswoman Jackson Lee, for these hearings, but I'm also frustrated for the tone that some of this has taken, because it takes us away from the economic underpinnings of what needs to go on here.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield to the gentleman from Louisiana.
I thank my colleague. This has really been a thoughtful discussion. I know we're nearing the end of it. We have more to go. Thanks, everybody, for their patience. I just want to touch on something the Reverend Sutton said a moment ago about America being good. It is good. It is the greatest nation in the history of the world. There's a reason for that. G.K. Chesterton was a famous British philosopher. He famously said, America is the only nation in the world that is founded upon a creed. And he said it's listed with almost theological lucidity in the Declaration of Independence. What is the creed? We are the first people in the history of the world that openly acknowledged, boldly declared, that we are created in the image of God, and therefore every single person has inalienable human rights. That is a self-evident truth, the founder said. We're trying to live up to that promise. As you all know, Martin Luther King Jr. famously said that was a promissory note to future generations, and we're trying to get there. The honest question that we're trying to get to is the payment, okay, which would be part of this by many people's estimation, is that part of that attaining the ultimate goal? And it's a thoughtful question. It's a serious one. And I don't think that you should disparage. I don't think that you should disparage the motives of anybody who's asking these piercing questions. And we're going to, and we are. You're all part of the dialogue, and I'm grateful that it's largely been a civil discussion today, and I really appreciate your contributions. Let me go back to Mr. Owens. In a 2018 interview, you noted that, you said, quote, "It was the black community that led our country in terms of the growth of the middle class. Between 40 and 50% of black Americans became part of the middle class. The black community also led the country in terms of the commitment of men to marriage at over 70%, unquote." I wonder if you could elaborate a little bit on what you attribute that to.
Head, heart, home, hands. We were a race that believed in God, very committed to the Christian faith. Because we did, our men believed in being the men of their household to provide for their kids and their wife, and they took that commitment very seriously. They took pride in being producers. The idea of me being a beggar was not an option. When I failed after coming out of the NFL, 7 years after coming out of the NFL, totally humbling. But for a brief few months, I was willing to be a chimney sweep. I was willing to be a security guard. That was the way we were taught. Do whatever it takes to provide for your family. It doesn't matter. Be proud of it. And I'm proud of it now. We'll never want to go there again. But at the end of the day, that's what we were taught. We have now, we're turning out my race into one that's feeling that they're entitled to somebody else's property. We're now asking for something, reparation, that we'll get to funding, but something we never experienced ourselves in our lives. Are not owed, because we have the chance every single day to make a choice. I can choose a day to be more successful or less. And that has nothing to do with my ancestor, my great-great-grandfather Silas, other than the fact I'm so proud that he showed me through his example how to overcome obstacles. So we need to get back the pride that we had during the 40s, 50s, and 60s as a race, when we were competing against the white race, when we were segregated, when our money stayed within our community, and our leadership stayed in our community. We weren't trying to get out to somebody else's race to give them our business. We need to recognize that within our kids is our future. I personally believe this. Right now we have over 60,000 of our youth that's incarcerated every single year. These kids, most of them, 85% don't have fathers. We were able to get those kids back, to give them the hope that this country can give them a great opportunity, that they can go out and build businesses or move their future on. They will bring us back to the abyss. And I believe those kids, the ones that we give hope again, will bring our country back from the abyss. We need to give them the right message first.
Very well said. Mr. Hughes, I know there's a lot's been said here, and I know you have thoughts on a lot of these topics. I'll just yield back to you for 55 minutes here, pitch it to you. What would you like to add to the conversation?
Oh dear, a lot has been said. I'm not sure there's any one specific thing at this moment I want to respond to.
That's great. I respect that. Listen, we're probably out of time or out of questions on this side, but again, on behalf of everybody here, I think I speak for all my colleagues, we really appreciate your interest, your involvement, your patience today. It's been a long hearing, but I think we've had a thoughtful discussion. I think it's important for the country for us to do this. So I'm grateful, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson. Ms. Escobar of Texas is next. 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. And I want to just say how proud I am and fortunate I feel to be in the room with all of you, to be able to have this very important discussion and to participate in this historic hearing. I also just want to quickly acknowledge and thank my sister, Congresswoman, the gentlelady from Texas. Thank you, Sheila, for your incredible work and your passion and the dignity and strength that you bring to this discussion. And as my colleague from California, Ms. Bass, mentioned, this is a difficult conversation to have, but one that is so long overdue. Dr. Malveaux, I so appreciate your economic perspective, and I want to ask you a couple of questions rooted in that economic background that you have so that you can help the country understand the significance of why we have to have this conversation. So first, I'd like to ask you to respond to critics of this bill who claim that the U.S. has already paid reparations to African Americans through affirmative action. How would you respond to that?
Sister Congresswoman, for the question. Let me say that affirmative action, the primary beneficiaries of affirmative action actually were white women. And there's a significant research that shows that because white women were better poised to take advantage of the benefits that affirmative action provided. You have disadvantage and discrimination. The African American community had disadvantage plus discrimination. White women simply had discrimination. So when you go back and look at the data, you will not find that African Americans significantly benefited from affirmative action. It was a lot of talk and not a lot of action. So, you know, when people talk about we've already paid reparations, I've heard people talk about the fact that, you know, white people died in the Civil War fighting on the side of the North. Well, the North was also a beneficiary of enslavement, quite frankly, and my sister here who's talked about her family has lifted that up. So, no, the reparations have not been paid, and the fact is that we're not, as again, some folks may want checks, but what we're really talking about is closing that wealth gap and making people whole.
Thank you. And to that point about the wealth gap, you have remarked and pointed out that the income gap was actually shrinking until government played a role. The income gap for formerly enslaved individuals.
The wealth gap, actually.
The wealth gap, I'm sorry.
The wealth gap was shrinking until Jim Crow laws and profligate racism intruded in the ways that people were able to live their lives. So that people, the Tommy Moss story that I told a little bit of, the guy who opened the grocery store, Ida B. Wells' goddaughter's dad, opened a grocery store, he dared to compete with white people. And because he dared to compete with white people, he basically lost his life. Tulsa, Oklahoma, when the governor of Oklahoma actually appointed a commission to find out why the Wall Street massacre occurred, one of the newspapers came up with this conclusion: too many N-words have too much money. That was the conclusion of an official government commission. And Black Wall Street was amazing. Dr. Olivia Hooker, who passed just last November, was the oldest living survivor, and she was a friend. And she said, we didn't have to leave the black community for anything except for banking. We had our own grocery stores, department stores. Black doctors built a library when white folks wouldn't build a library for black people. That kind of economic thriving became a source of envy. Wilmington, North Carolina, where Brother Man over here wants to talk about, people want to talk ugly about Democrats. People change their ideologies. So the Democrats were the devil once upon a time. There were these groups called the Red Shirts, which were the Klan. They were Democrats. However, the Republicans took that over. They became the devil. And I'm just saying, and forgive me, Brother Chairman, I know you said I'm not supposed to say that. Forgive me. But in any case, people do change ideologies. So all this throwing at Democrats and Republicans have been racist, but in Wilmington, North Carolina, Republicans and black people came together to form a fusion government. And white folks were so frightened that they took all the prominent black men in that town, arrested them. The next morning gave them tickets to leave town. They had to leave their property, their livelihood, their families, everything. This is why we need reparations. White Democrats, yes, Democrats were so threatened by the notion of this fusion government that they basically burned people out. They've documented 60 deaths, but there's a film, when I was talking and you told me I couldn't talk, there's a film called Wilmington on Fire. I want everybody to watch this film, Wilmington on Fire. It really does talk about what happened in Wilmington in 1898 when they just basically burned black folks out. 25% of the black people in Wilmington left. Nearly a third of the black businesses in Wilmington went out of business. It was really about economic envy. So absent this economic envy and fear, black folks, we didn't get the 40 acres and a mule, but we were still trying to do it. And then folks came in and said, wait a minute, if we let them do their thing, where's our cheap labor going to come from? You know, and so that's what happened. Thank you for the question.
Thank you so much, Chairman. I'm out of time.
Appreciate it very much. And last but far from least is the sponsor of H.R. 40, the Honorable Sheila Jackson Lee, for her 5 minutes plus. You're ready.
Thank you.
It is appropriate for me, Mr. Chairman, to thank you so very much, and to dispel this audience from any suggestion and witnesses that we're here on a temporary pass, doing temporary work that's going to be fleeting and never to be seen again. I want to thank Chairman Cohen, who comes from the heart of Memphis and Tennessee, who has walked in the life of a dual society. And I want to thank Chairman Nadler, who, as he indicated, as I did, supported H.R. 40 and the leadership of John Conyers. I want to thank all of my colleagues on this panel for their diligence and outstanding questions. They are going to be in the forefront of educating, answering the questions, being a team, and I look forward to their work on this very powerful committee, Judiciary Committee. What better place to have this hearing? And to those who are, again, trying to understand our process, you have to have a hearing, then there is something called a markup, then there is a vote in the committee, and then there's the opportunity to go to the floor of the House of Representatives, on to the Senate, which will be the other body, as we call it, and the challenge that I will accept, and I hope that you will accept, and then a signature by a President of the United States of America. Let this day, June 19th, 2019, be the marker for the commitment for each and every one of you who have come to support, to say, on my watch, we will watch this bill pass and be signed by the President of the United States of America. I want to acknowledge Pastor Alan Patterson, who is from my hometown, and he is, I know he wouldn't mind me say, the inheritor, a great historic church in historic Fifth Ward, Texas, that was a settling place for freed slaves, Mount Corinth Baptist Church. I'm delighted that he is here, and I thank him. All the others I have thanked. Let me thank the witnesses. Mr. Chairman is very kind, but I will be diligent. Let me thank the witnesses who are here, each and every one of them. Let me thank Mr. Coates, Mr. Glover, Ms. Brown, Hughes, Ms. Owens, the Right Reverend Eugene Taylor Sutton, and as well Dr. Julianne Malveaux, Professor Eric Miller. And let me get to my questions at this point. During the Red Summer of 1919, violence against African American communities erupted. 2 years later, in the Tulsa race riot, 300 African Americans were killed, and the entire black community of Greenwood in Tulsa, Oklahoma was destroyed. Another devastating racist attack took place in Rosewood, Florida in 1923. Black-owned homes and businesses were systematically burned. At least 8 people were killed, and despite African American service in World War II. I commend Mr. Coleman and I think Mr. Owens and Mr. Hughes, read the bill. What the bill says is that this is a study to consider a national apology, which has been done, and a proposal for reparations for the institution of slavery. Yes. The institution of slavery has never gone away. It exists. It is subsequent to de jure and de facto. That is, that it is subject to the laws and to the current atmosphere of what has generated today racial and economic discrimination against African Americans and the impact of these forces on living African Americans that are to make recommendations to the Congress on appropriate remedies and for other purposes. Why does the Congress have to do it? Because the Congress is the lawmaking body of the federal government, and it was the states and federal government that institutionalized laws that made slavery an act of the state. Yes. And it's not the courts. They will interpret, but we have to correct our error. And that is why, in that historic moment, Republicans and I guess some Democrats came together in the Congress and supported the 13th Amendment, which then Democrats and Republicans, or whatever they were called at that time, throughout the states, then the states voted to accept that particular amendment. That is why the Congress must do its job. I welcome the disparate opinions But I would argue to the gentleman from Columbia that you are, I think, without the historical perspective and the pain of being opposed at your very young age to affirmative action and reparations. So I would welcome a continuing debate. My door is open for you. I welcome you being here as a witness. But I think it is important to take note of this. One, not my husband, excuse me, love him too. My father was Ezra Clyde Jackson. He was the baby boy of a widow mother with three brothers that went to World War II. A young man that graduated from the High School for Arts in New York City. He, out of high school, went to the cartoon industry in New York. It was thriving. What an amazing thing for a young black boy. When the white men came back from World War II, my father was summarily fired for them to take his place. I was not born then, but I can tell you that the life of that talented black man was never the same. Until some 40 years later, when he was able to, his talent never lost, able to be called back into that industry. Racism. It wasn't slavery, wasn't 1892. It was in these prosperous 40s that you were talking about, that my father, because of the color of his skin, his brilliant talent, the cartoonist artist that he was summarily fired. And so the question I have, Dr. Malveaux, while the white middle class was being buoyed by the New Deal period of my father's life, African Americans were consistently excluded from its benefits. For example, the 1935 Social Security Act carved out jobs largely filled by African American workers, such as farm and domestic labor, from its old age and unemployment insurance. Federal housing programs also discriminated against African Americans by redlining black neighborhoods to preclude them from receiving Federal Housing Administration, FHA. The GI Bill, which dedicated billions of dollars toward expanding opportunity for soldiers returning from war, also contributed to the widening gap between white and black Americans. Southern congressional leaders made certain that the programs were controlled by local white officials, resulting in black veterans being denied housing and business loans. Now, Dr. Malveaux, I want to get to your seatmate there, Mr. Miller. So I'm going to you first, and I also want to get to Mr. Coates on these issues, and I thank all the other witnesses. Could you comment on this impact, this continuing impact, when we didn't benefit from that?
And both for the hearing and for the question, the continuing impact is it shows up in the wealth gap. In addition, the entirety of the way that we redlined black communities through the Federal Housing Administration, redlined communities so that people could not get housing loans, even when they qualified for them. This was government policy. This is why Congress must do this. Congress did the devil, and now Congress has to do the right thing. It's quite simple. I'm so happy that you mentioned the GI Bill for a couple of reasons. Number one, as you said, the state authorities decided who got benefits. In the state of Mississippi, fewer than 1,000, and the number is 600 or 700, but I'm going to just round up, fewer than 1,000 black men were able to go to college on the GI Bill for Mississippi. Because when they went to get their GI benefits, the GI board said, oh, you could go to barber school. Oh, you could go to trade school. But these were brothers who were qualified to go to college, should have had that opportunity, would have had generational differences in the way they lived had they done that. So Congress has indifferently, essentially sidelined black people from the opportunities that they created for white people. It's plain and simple. Sideline us for those opportunities, and that's why it's time now to talk about how to fix that. My brother, who has done the work on Tulsa, can talk so much more about that, but let us simply say the commission that is created must go through line by line and look at all this and detail it. I don't like to think, like I said, I'm not kumbaya, so I don't like to think that white people are evil. I think white people are ignorant. I think white people do not know what the history is, and I commend y'all to look at the history and the work that you've done in the past, and then challenge you to do the right thing.
Thank you. Thank you. Mr. Coates, may I just May I bring you to the 21st century and a recent article in the New York Times that basically says, yeah, thank you. But in the shadows, this is Kansas City. Downtown is booming, but in the shadows of the city's thriving business and entertainment district are languishing east side neighborhoods pocked with boarded up homes, overgrown trash-strewn lots. The shiny caps and storefronts are almost non-existent, and residents like the Tanya Bowman felt forgotten. I love downtown, and I'd love to see it grow too, but you've got to be real, says Ms. Bowman, who lives in the predominantly black east side. It's like neglect. We get the leftovers. Can you just bring that all together for us in what you have ascertained about the commission, racism, and where we are today?
Sure. I think the consistent point from the comments that, you just made, an article you just read from, stretching all the way back to the period of enslavement in this country, is the idea of theft. Enslavement is theft. 250 years, black people had the fruits of their labor stolen from them. We don't often think about Jim Crow and the era of segregation as theft, but it's theft too. If I agree to pay taxes, if I agree to fealty to a government, and you give me a different level of resources out of that tax pool, if you've given me a different level of protection, you have effectively stolen from me. If you deny my ability to vote and to participate in the political process, to decide how those resources are used, you have effectively stolen from me. And so it makes a kind of sense that after a period that begins in 1619 of theft, ending conservatively in 1968, I think I get an argument on that, but conservatively in 1968, that if you steal from a group of people over that longer a period of time, you will have the very wealth gap that Dr. Malveaux resulted from. I think it's very, very important to bring that into the conversation because this wasn't a passive discrimination. This was appropriating resources from one group and giving them to the other through the auspices of the state.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I am very grateful to you to yield back, and I feel the power in this room. I'd ask my colleague, Mr. Johnson, let us work together. Let's get this done. It is long overdue, it is deserving, and it is the right thing to do. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Lee. And, of course, I want to thank all of our witnesses. This concludes today's hearing, and I want to thank our witnesses. It's been a great panel. And this is what magnified times 10, 20, 50 study would be like, because this panel would be heard and heard and heard, and people would get the story of what's happened in America and different perspectives on how to deal with it. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days to submit additional written questions for the witnesses or additional material for the record. I want to thank our ranking member and all of my members. Our attendance was excellent. If anybody sees John Stewart, tell him everybody was here and very attentive. And for that, the hearing's adjourned.
Okay.